Welcome to Classic Movie Club. I'm your host, Chad Knurk, the digital editor of Film Review. We've been celebrating cinema here at Film Review since 1944. Last month, we took a look behind the scenes at costume design, and this month we're taking a look at the pieces that accentuated, and in some cases, made the look. I'm talking about jewelry, but not just any old diamond, ruby, or sapphire. The costume jewelry that made Joseff of Hollywood both the height of elegance and a household name. Founded in 1928 by Eugene Joseff, Joseff of Hollywood has been providing jewelry rentals to movie studios since the golden era of Hollywood. Joseff of Hollywood often worked in tandem with costume designers. There's actually a great story about Eugene Joseff, costume designer Walter Plunkett, and Lana Turner. When censors opposed the cut of Turner's gowns in the 1948 The Three Musketeers, Joseff told Plunkett not to scrap the costumes. Instead, he came up with a brooch that was strategically placed to make the censors happy, and it gave Plunkett's costumes a regal air. The brooches were among the Joseff lots that came up for auction back in 2017, and though portions of the collection have come to auction in the past, remarkably, Joseff has maintained well over 200,000 pieces in their studio collection. A source once reported that up to 85% of jewelry seen on the silver screen at the height of movie glamour throughout the 1930s and 40s was provided by Joseff of Hollywood. And today, the company lives on, still owned and operated by the Joseff family. A large part of the rental collection is still intact, and the family continues the work began by Eugene and Joan Joseff, renting jewels to productions, as well as continuing the retail line. Located in the historic Max Factor building around the block from the TCL Chinese Theater at the corner of Hollywood Boulevard and Highland Avenue, the Hollywood Museum is a 501c3 nonprofit showcasing an extensive collection of more than 10,000 treasures, showcasing more than 100 years of film, and founded by philanthropist and history lover Donelle Dadigan. The Hollywood Museum's latest exhibit, Joseff of Hollywood Vintage Movie Costume Jewelry, highlights pieces from the Joseff Collection Vault, sharing them on public view for the very first time. Guests are invited to view Marilyn Monroe's intricate diamante bracelet from How to Marry a Millionaire and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, the brooch accented with pearls that Billy Burke wore as Glinda, the Witch of the North in The Wizard of Oz, a necklace worn by Rita Hayworth in Gilda, Clark Gable's carnelian and gold watch fob from Gone with the Wind, and a white sapphire and amethyst necklace worn by Deanna Durbin in Up in Central Park, and subsequently worn by numerous actresses including Bette Davis, Elizabeth Taylor, and most recently India Amarteifio in Queen Charlotte, A Bridgerton Story. As Hollywood's premier costume jeweler to the stars, the work of Joseff is a true glimpse into the glamour of Hollywood's golden era. Today, my guests are Donelle Dadigan, founder and president of the Hollywood Museum, Tina Joseff, president and CEO of Joseff of Hollywood, and Kristin Joseff, managing director of Joseff of Hollywood. Let's join Donelle, Tina, and Kristin in the portrait gallery of the Hollywood Museum, where they're surrounded by walls of familiar faces and cases full of costume jewelry fit for the queens of the silver screen. Donelle, I'd love to ask you about your journey. How did the Hollywood Museum begin?
It's a love letter back to the community. Many people have said it started with insanity. I mean, it's so funny, but I think that everyone, no matter where you're from, you search for something that has to do with a wonderful recollection that you've had from a film or a television show, starting in your childhood or pivotal moments in your teenage years, in your early 20s, and your 30s, your 40s, your 50s. That it's all very interesting. And I think one of the things that I noticed, Chad, was when I was traveling for business, one time I landed up actually in the 90s, early 90s, I landed up in Singapore and then to Malaysia. And each time I had people ask me, where are you from? And I would say, oh, I'm from Los Angeles. And everyone would say, oh, that's so nice, but where in Los Angeles? And then I would say West LA, and they'd say, but where in Los Angeles? And that's when I realized when I said Hollywood, they all jumped. They all gravitated because they all have some fond idea or recollection or a dream about what Hollywood is. So I realized it didn't matter what language you spoke, whether you spoke English or not. The one word that everybody understands all around the world is Hollywood. So I knew I had struck upon something, wanting to give back to the Hollywood community and create a museum about Los Angeles's #1 export, which is the motion picture and television industry. We showcase more than 10,000 exhibits, and it's Hollywood from its humble beginnings till today. Everyone always says to me, well, how'd you come across the Max Factor building, And it's my history of being a real estate, Nick. I was a real estate person. And of course, being raised here in Los Angeles, I don't know if you remember this or not, Tina, but 50 years ago, you didn't want to come to Hollywood. You wouldn't let your kids come to Hollywood because it was kind of rough and tumble, run down. I never came here as a child to see what Hollywood was all about. I'd heard about it. Meanwhile, my mom, who went to USC, it was a big deal at her time in, the late 30s, early 40s that, oh my gosh, we're going to go to Hollywood. And they'd have a chaperone, and several girls from USC would come together. They'd take the red car, which is like a street car, and they'd come to Hollywood. And it was a really big deal to be able to come, and they'd see a movie. They'd have a hot fudge sundae and CC Brown's. And before that, they would stop at the Max Factor building and buy one piece of makeup. It was very exciting for them to do such a thing. And so to think years later, we would be able to breathe life back into this building, the original Max Factor building that my mom and so many people came to, hoping to catch a glimpse of the movie stars when they were here. You never knew when they were going to come to those world famous makeup rooms, the redheads only room, the blondes only room. Redheads were Lucille Ball got her red hair, blonde were Marilyn Monroe became a blonde, and the brunettes only room with Elizabeth Taylor and fabulous brunettes that we know, and then the brownettes, which Max Factor thought was pretty much anyone who had medium brown hair, such as Judy Garland. And today, why I'm chatting about this is because today it's where we have the special Joseff of Hollywood exhibits, not only in our lobby, but also in each of the makeup rooms. And the pieces of jewelry are coordinated to the color of the hair of the actresses that wore them. It all links together, all roads lead to.
Tina, for those that may not know Eugene Joseff, how did Joseff become Hollywood's premier costume jeweler to the stars?
Well, it was the Depression, and then Joseff was living in Chicago and working all over basically the East Coast, and he was an ad man, and his hobby was making jewelry. So times were tough in Chicago, and he and his brother decided to go to Hollywood, where everybody seemed to be making money and being successful. So he took a train, came to Hollywood, and walked onto a studio lot, carrying this little, bag full of costume jewelry that he had made, and promoted himself.
I mean, you got to think about that, because in those days you could walk on a lot.
Right.
Today, you can't get near it.
Right. So he basically just said, this is what I can do. And of course, he had no money. So the first pieces he sold. And eventually, after building up inventory and making the pieces so that he could convert them from one stone to another stone, he could add links to a necklace, he could add, drops to a necklace. He made it so that the pieces were more versatile, and he got a lot more use out of them. And he had the idea, let's rent it. We don't sell it to them, re-rent it.
Isn't that brilliant?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning. And he amassed hundreds of thousands of pieces of jewelry in his studio. And those were rented over and over and over again. Most of them were created specifically for a certain movie, but once they were created for that movie, they went into the studio collection and they could be rented again and again. And that did happen a lot because the costume designers would come to Joseff, use his research library, which we had Harper's Bazaar back into the 1800s, Ladies' Field Journal. He had all of this research material. They would use his research material, draw their sketches, or he would say, I need something like this, and he would do the sketch. Then they would create the piece and it would be rented. And because the costume designers were now real familiar with that piece or those pieces, they would come back again and again. And a lot of the same movies made by the same costume designers with the same studios had so much of the same jewelry in them, but of course the outfits were different, stars were different.
Well, I'm also thinking, isn't there one film that Lucille Ball appeared in and then Lena Horne wore similar in?
Yes,
The bracelets?
yes, the bracelets, Broadway Rhythm, Lucille Ball wore them, and I think that was Look Who's Laughing.
She wore in publicity for Look Who's Laughing. And then Lena Horne wore them. She wore two of the bracelets. Lucille Ball had worn one necklace and one bracelet with the tassels. And then Nicole Kidman wore it in Being Ricardo's. The costume designer for that film reached out to us with inspiration photos. And as we were flipping through them, we said, oh, no, actually, we have that at the studio.
That's amazing.
That was about that.
Costume designer Walter Plunkett had a piece of this story, right?
Walter Plunkett was one of Joseph's great friends, and he used us when he did the Three Musketeers. And Joseph designed so many pieces from Walter's sketches, and we actually have these sketches, or some of these sketches, where he drew actually ornaments and brooches and buttons that stars wore on their costumes. He actually made, watercolor sketches that we would know the color of the stones. And then, of course, Gone with the Wind was, a big one with Walter Plunkett, too.
And the story goes that it was on sort of a dare from Walter Plunkett that Eugene Joseff really started working on these period pieces that he's so well known for. And that he was criticizing the practice of the time that the costume designers would create gowns and outfits for the leading actors and ladies, but the actresses were largely wearing their own jewelry on film. And so when you had a period film, the costumes were not necessarily matching up with the jewelry. And when he sort of gave Walter Plunkett a hard time about it, as the story goes, he said, well, if you can do better, then try it. And so he did.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about this, first of all, with the museum, if these walls could talk. And many of the actresses who landed up wearing Joseff jewelry in their films came in to Max Factor, and in these world famous makeup rooms is where they got their looks to become the movie stars that we recognize them as. So we've kind of come full circle here in the museum, and I'm thinking, I first met Tina, I don't know, was it 20 years ago? Inadvertently, we met, and I was able to speak with Joan. It was amazing. Joan Joseff, the Joan Joseff, which was just extraordinary. It's sometimes not what you know, but who you know. And then we met again, and then years later, it was Kristin who got in touch with me. So with Joan, we had talked about doing an exhibit, and then, yes, no, maybe this, that, whatever. She was not well at the end, and then you had your hands full, Tina, and so then I get this phone call. But that's kind of how everything in this museum, in the Hollywood Museum, is that it's through relationships. It's through the studios, it's through the production companies, it's through acquaintances, it's through the stars themselves or their heirs or fans that we come to be involved with different organizations and different professionals, and then that's how an exhibit starts and how we get going with this. I mean, when we got started, I had no idea how fabulous this was going to turn out. In all honesty, I have to
I know,
say,
it's pretty impressive, and I'd say that, and I've been around it for,
it truly is. And, we're sitting in this room and you can't see it because we're looking at it. But I mean, I have a piece of the original Hollywood sign from the 20s that's on the wall, complete with bullet holes and graffiti. And there's 1,000 vintage black and white photos in here. Many of the stars that are up on the walls with their famous looks have worn Joseff jewelry in their films. I mean, all roads lead back to the main source. And that is why I'm so thrilled we're able to connect those stories. And we're doing it here in a building. Like I said, if these walls could talk, Max Factor Makeup Studios, it'd be fabulous. It's just amazing. It's a perfect location for the Hollywood Museum.
it's a perfect location for our exhibit. And we've really never exhibited, the pieces anywhere, only in our studio. So this is really, we've had a few, like the Academy had an exhibit of pieces. We had the San Francisco International Airport had an exhibit, but this is one in our own backyard. This is where it all began. So this is the perfect location, and it's showcased beautifully.
Well, and the Hollywood Museum is honored. And what is extraordinary is that we've made a great friendship with the Joseff women. Let me tell you, these ladies are fabulous. We actually get along. We actually come together, we actually go out together, we actually go to wild places. We're not telling you where we're going tomorrow night, but we are.
But look for the pictures.
I will. That's great. Yeah. How did you collaborate on putting this exhibit together? And with such a robust and rich collection at Joseff, how did you begin to narrow down what to include in the exhibit?
We came for the initial visit and we did a walkthrough of the museum, and everywhere we were walking, we were going, oh, that's our jewelry. Oh, that's our jewelry. Oh, look, there's so-and-so wearing our jewelry.
And not just jewelry that we made, that we know of, it's, oh, we have that in the studio, we can
Right.
bring that to the
Right.
exhibit.
Right, because many of the costumes that they saw, and they thought, oh my gosh, this costume is from a film that we provided jewelry for. If we could make this together, wouldn't this be fun? And it's just all these different ideas. You talk about 6 degrees of separation, but here in the Hollywood Museum, it's 1 or 2.
In the beginning, when we were discussing how to put the exhibit together, the conceptualization of putting the jewelry worn by the stars who would have been here to have their hair and makeup done and everything partly came about because Donelle had costumes on display here at the Hollywood Museum, and we go, oh, we actually have the necklace that goes with this dress. In fact, if you go into the brunette room, you can see our necklace on a mannequin with the dress that Elizabeth Taylor wore.
Right.
And over and over and over as we walked through, we kept saying that. And for a while in the beginning, Donelle kept saying, well, where do you think that it would be an appropriate place in this museum for your pieces and everything? And we just kept saying, well, how much real estate do you want to give up?
Right.
And I think that's the part that she was alluding to, being a little bit surprised about, was the quantity of it.
The enormity, yes.
We could strip everything out that we have in here and fill all the cases back up with new pieces without that.
And
Without
probably
reusing anything.
And
That's
probably
amazing.
Pictures on the wall too. I mean, we have so many photographs of the stars wearing our jewelry that were our publicity or studio publicity. And then, the sketches from the costume designers, these were all things that, autograph sketches from all the different stars that Joseff had adorned, during the 30s and the 40s.
In terms of how intricate or delicate so many of these pieces are, which ones stand out to you?
Well, probably I would say one of the most impressive pieces to me was the topaz beveled necklace, which was worn by Tallulah Bankhead, Ona Munson, Alice Faye, and all in different configurations. It's an elaborate bib necklace that really would go from your neck down to your belly button. That's how large it is. But it was made so that you could remove pieces, and I believe it was Alice Faye wore it And it's basically just a choker. And when Tallulah Bankhead wore it, it was this, mid-size, right above the bosom. And then when Oni Munson wore it, it was covered her whole chest, but it was all made.
It goes down to your belly button. When you
It
wear
does.
I loved that necklace so much that I asked my husband to make one for me. And he did.
It's in the family. What can I say? It's
Yes.
all in the family.
That's right.
When you were saying some of the more delicate pieces, some of the pieces that I find the most fascinating are the ones that have been worn and reused so many times that they've become fragile because they've had so many repairs. And we have one necklace here in the portrait gallery that was a piece that went with what we used to call the imperial necklace. And if you flip the bracelet over, you can see, we call them scars, where they've been repaired by solder over and over and over. And that tells you how many times they were worn and how popular they were. We know that it was worn in Marie Antoinette. So it does date back at least to 1930, right?
Anna and the King of Siam.
But I find the history behind those pieces to be really fascinating because you know that you're holding something with a lot of stories.
Right. And because things were being rented out, there were so many different necks or hands that wore those pieces.
Absolutely. And it was always a working studio. No one knew that Hollywood memorabilia would become its own industry.
Can you
And
think
so-
of the
so many-
DNA that's on each of these pieces? I mean, think about that with all these movie stars, all these celebrities wearing this.
Some of the tiaras have the original netting with hairs in them. So when Donelle talks about DNA, she means it.
What pieces in the exhibit will audiences coming to the museum get to see? We've mentioned a few, but what are some of the other highlights?
We've created vignettes for different stars through the makeup rooms. And so we have whole collections dedicated to Marlene Dietrich and Judy Garland, Bette Davis. In the blonde room, you can see items worn by Marilyn Monroe. We actually have quite a few in there. We can take you to the redhead room where you have pieces worn by Rita Hayworth and Lucille Ball and Maureen O'Hara. And also in the portrait gallery, we kind of take you on a walk through time, and we've made a point of bringing in pieces that were worn sort of now and then. And so we have pieces that were worn in the original films from the 1930s that were re-rented out to Bridgerton or to Netflix's Hollywood or even on HBO's Westworld.
I love that. I love the idea of these pieces walking you through Hollywood history. And Joseff of Hollywood has such a rich cinematic legacy. Why is that so vital to preserve?
Well, I would say because it's not just the family history, it's the history of Hollywood, the history of California, the history of movie making and the beginnings of television. These are things that we all live with in our lives. Like Donelle said, when you say Hollywood, everybody wants to know about Hollywood. And that's what this collection covers. It covers, because all the movies were different. Like Anna and the King of Siam. We created a whole persona around that with the jewelry, because the jewelry was a major part of, every little child in that had jewelry on. The wives had jewelry on.
right.
We have photographs, and the pieces, half of them weren't plated. A lot of them weren't even finished, but they put them on the characters because these were just background characters. And the demand for mass quantities of jewelry was so great that they couldn't turn it out fast enough. So if it was a background character, there was stones missing or just incomplete pieces.
And one of the things that I don't think gets enough credit is not only is Hollywood history become its own industry, but the movies that we grew up with shaped our perceptions of the cultures they depicted. They shaped our perceptions of what American life was. You grew up watching the films. I grew up watching classic films with my mother. And a lot of our view of the world was shaped by these films, by these depictions that we saw. And it's really neat to be a part of that legacy.
I'd love to hear if each of you has a favorite memory around movie going, around perhaps a film that has Joseff pieces in it?
Well, I can remember seeing The Wizard of Oz, and at that time, of course, I did not know that we actually had jewelry in The Wizard of Oz. You had a mix of reality and fantasy, and then all of this beautiful scenery and everything, and of course, the Emerald City with everything it's cracked up to be. So that to me was a really iconic film, and that we actually had jewelry in it was pretty amazing.
And you can see, which actually in the
That's here.
lobby here at the Joseff of Hollywood exhibit at the Max Factor building by Miss Gulch's glasses from the beginning part of the film and their own pair of ruby slippers.
We should talk about the fact that Eugene Joseff, he not only made this fabulous, fabulous jewelry for the leading of film, but also for the men, which is, we don't think about that. And so I think, Tina, you can touch on that because that's very extraordinary. Rhett Butler, Clark Gable from Gone with the Wind.
Of course, all the women fell in love with Rhett Butler, and we all wanted to be Vivian Leigh, only maybe not with all those little temper tantrums. Of course, Walter Plunkett did all the wonderful costumes. The cigar case that Clark Gable tossed in for the cause was created by Joseff. And for years, we just kept thinking that inside that cigar case was a belt buckle, but it wasn't actually a belt buckle. It was actually another piece to replace the piece on top of the cigar case, because he used a cigar case after he tossed the original one in. So basically all they did was they just took the central piece off the top and replaced it with this other piece. And it was a very prevalent piece in the movie.
It was an interchangeable face.
Right.
That gives us some insight into how they're thinking behind the scenes, the practical approach of creating these pieces.
Right. I mean, that was one of his major, business practices, was make it convertible, make it easy to change, expand your inventory. And that was one of the ways to do it, was to make all of these pieces easily changeable.
We have other Gone with the Wind pieces that are not currently on display that might make their way into the museum in the future as well. It was a movie that I watched with my mother every summer, my entire childhood. And funny story, when Jeff and I got married, Tina's son Jeff and I got married, Jeff wore Clark Gable's Moonstone cufflinks from the film.
Oh, amazing.
And I almost changed the colors of our wedding so that I could wear Scarlett O'Hara's amethyst necklace. I ended up settling on a different necklace that Vivian Leigh had worn at some point for a publicity still. As far as other movie memories, one of my favorites was All About Eve. And there were two brooches. Oftentimes they would rent out duplicates to make sure that they could change them out during filming. One of those brooches that Bette Davis wore in her most famous dress in the scene,
Yeah.
It's going to be a bumpy night, can be seen in the Brownette room here.
That's fantastic.
And can you mention anything else about Joseff? We're not just a part of Hollywood history. We are still a working studio providing rentals. We've got tens of thousands of pieces available for rent, and we have just updated our online store for the Our Lady retail line.
There you have it, a family brand, an institution of the silver screen still going strong, and a museum in the heart of Hollywood with a rich legacy all its own. Of course, many of our former film review contributors once walked those hallowed Max Factor halls, from Rita Hayworth to Lana Turner. Once again, my thanks to Donelle Dadigan, Tina Joseff, and Kristin Joseff. You can learn much more about the Hollywood Museum and Joseff of Hollywood by visiting our show notes, and be sure to catch the Joseff of Hollywood exhibit and all the collections that await you at the Hollywood Museum. That's our show. We hope you enjoyed the journey. If you like what we do, please consider becoming a member of Classic Movie Club. Your support helps us produce a new episode each month and continue the legacy of film review. Don't forget to subscribe, like, review, and share the podcast with all your film friends, and we invite you back next month for another adventure. Until then, here's looking at you, kid.